Have you ever sat alone at your own kitchen table on your birthday, listening to the silence, and realized that the person you sacrificed everything for couldn't even be bothered to pick up the phone? That was me, 63 years old, sitting in the house I had kept spotless for 38 years, watching a lemon cake with 3 candles slowly melt on the counter. Candles I had lit myself, while my daughter-in-law Sandra posted photos of her and my son at a brewery in Whistler. I should back up. My name is Louise, and for most of my adult life, I was what people in small Ontario towns call a good woman. I married my husband, Victor Hadley, when I was 24 years old. Victor was a quiet, careful man, the kind who kept a notebook of everything that mattered to him. Appointments, savings targets, recipes he wanted to try, things he wanted to say to people before it was too late. He was an engineer, methodical and gentle, and he loved me in that steady, unremarkable way that only becomes remarkable once it's gone. We built a life in Barrie, not a flashy life, but a real one. Victor worked for a civil engineering firm for 31 years. I taught 3rd grade at a public school for 26 years, then took early retirement when Victor's health started slipping. We had one son, our son, Nathaniel Hadley, and we poured everything we had into raising him well. We saved carefully. We lived modestly. We said no to things we wanted so Nathaniel could have things he needed, and eventually things he simply wanted. Victor passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held his hand in a room at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, and he looked at me and said, "You know what to do, Lou. You always did." I thought he meant grief. I thought he meant that I would find my way through it. I didn't understand, not yet, that he meant something more specific than that. After Victor died, I was alone for the first time in my life. I had my pension, the house, the investments Victor had quietly tended for decades. And I had Nathaniel, or so I thought. Nathaniel and Sandra moved to Vancouver 3 years before Victor passed, which I understood. People follow work. People follow their lives. What I didn't understand, what took me longer to accept than I would like to admit, was how thoroughly Vancouver seemed to swallow them both. Phone calls became monthly, then sporadic. Visits dropped to once a year, sometimes less. Victor's death brought Nathaniel home for 8 days, and Sandra spent most of those days taking long walks and replying to emails on her phone while I made food nobody asked for. But I told myself, grief looks different for everyone. I told myself, he lost his father too. I kept telling myself things like that for 3 more years. The birthday I'm talking about, my 63rd, fell on a Saturday in late October. I had been hoping, not expecting, just hoping, that Nathaniel might come home for it. It was a round enough number. It had been 14 months since I'd seen him in person. I mentioned, in passing, during a call in August, that October was coming. He said, "Yeah, for sure, we'll figure something out." I knew what "we'll figure something out" meant. I had been a mother long enough to know that it meant nothing at all. So I baked the lemon cake myself, Victor's favorite, which had somehow become mine. And I invited my neighbor and closest friend, Patrice Okafor, over for the afternoon. Patrice brought wine and a card with a heron on it because she knows I love herons. We sat at the kitchen table, and she talked me through most of October, which is something Patrice is very good at. She has a way of filling rooms that would otherwise be very empty. By 6 o'clock, Patrice had gone home to her husband, and I was alone again. I checked my phone. There was a text from Nathaniel that said, "Happy birthday, Mom! Crazy weekend over here. We'll call soon." That was all. I put the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a while looking at the 3 half-melted candles in the cake. Then I cut myself a slice, poured a glass of wine I hadn't opened for Patrice, and sat down at the table by myself. 2 days later, Nathaniel called. Not to follow up on the birthday. He called because he had a question about the property in Muskoka. Victor and I had bought a small cottage on a lake outside Gravenhurst 30 years ago. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, a dock that needed replanking every few years. But Victor loved it with a quiet ferocity that surprised even me. He spent the last summer of his life on that porch reading and watching the water. Before he died, he told me the cottage was mine to do with as I chose. Nathaniel asked, "Have you thought at all about what happens to the Muskoka place? Long term, I mean." I was silent for a moment. "Long term," I repeated. "Yeah, like, whether you're planning to keep it or, what the arrangement would be." I asked him if he'd meant to call me on my birthday. He said, "Mom, I texted you." I said I knew. There was a pause. He said, "Is something wrong?" I told him nothing was wrong. And I ended the call not long after, because I could feel something shifting inside me that I didn't want him to hear in my voice. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter and more frightening. The sensation of looking at something clearly, for the first time, without the filter of hope. That was the night I started to understand what Victor had meant when he said, "You know what to do." I didn't do anything immediately. That's important to say, because I want you to understand that what eventually happened wasn't a reaction. It wasn't a snap decision made in hurt and anger. Over the following weeks, I thought carefully. I walked along the lakeshore path near my house in the early mornings, and I let myself feel the full weight of the years. Every school concert I attended alone because Victor was working late. Every Sunday roast I cooked that Nathaniel barely touched before heading back out the door. Every call I had coached myself not to make because I didn't want to seem needy. I thought about Sandra too. Sandra, who had, at our last Christmas together, mentioned 3 times that the house in Barrie was a lot of space for one person. Sandra, who had suggested, with a careful kind of brightness, that some people found it really freeing to downsize in their 60s. I started paying attention to things I had been too willing to overlook. In December, 2 months after my birthday, I had a call with Nathaniel that I almost didn't answer. I had started letting some of his calls go to voicemail, telling myself I was busy, which was partially true. This time I picked up. He was talking quickly, that anxious, overbright tone that I recognized from his teenage years, when he was asking for something he already suspected the answer to. He wanted to talk about the cottage again, and this time the conversation was longer. He mentioned, carefully, that Sandra's parents had offered to help them think through a path forward on the Gravenhurst property. He mentioned that his financial advisor, a phrase I had never heard him use before, had raised some questions about estate planning and whether I had updated my documents since Victor passed. I asked who had told him what was in Victor's estate documents. He stumbled. He said something about making reasonable assumptions. After the call, I sat for a long time in Victor's old armchair, the green one I had kept in the study even though it clashed with everything, and I thought about reasonable assumptions. Then I called Victor's financial advisor. His name was Howard Teschuk, and he had managed our family accounts for over 20 years. He was a careful, unassuming man from Sudbury who drove a sensible car and sent Christmas cards every year. I had not spoken to him since the paperwork following Victor's death, and I had not thought to call him in the years since, because I trusted that everything was in order. He picked up on the second ring and said my name like he had been expecting me. I said, "Howard, I think it's time I understood exactly where things stand," he said. "Louise, I think so too. And there's something Victor asked me to give you when you were ready." I went to Howard's office the following week. I drove myself, which I mention only because Sandra had once suggested, delicately, that the drive to Sudbury might be getting to be a lot for me. I had driven to Sudbury in February road conditions without difficulty for 30 years, but I noted the comment and filed it away with the others. Howard's office was on the second floor of a low brick building near the downtown core. Practical. No flourishes. He met me at the door and brought me in and made me tea before he sat down. Then he slid a plain white envelope across the desk. Victor's handwriting on the front. My name, just Louise, the way he always wrote it when it was only for me. Howard said, "He left this with me 2 months before he passed. He asked me to hold it until you came asking for it, and not to mention it unless you did." I looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then I asked how Victor knew I would come asking. Howard smiled. He said, "You always found your way to the right door eventually." I took the envelope home and sat in the kitchen and opened it. Victor had written 4 pages in his careful, even hand. The kind of handwriting you don't see much anymore. Every letter formed like it mattered. He started by saying he was sorry, not for anything specific, but for the things he had seen in Nathaniel and had not known how to say aloud. The selfishness that had crept in quietly over the years, the way their son had learned, somewhere along the way, to look at the people who loved him and calculate what they were worth. "I don't say this to make you angry," Victor wrote. "I say it because I want you to have your eyes open. You have always seen the best in him, and that is one of the things I love most about you. But I don't want your kindness to cost you your peace. He wrote that he had restructured several of his accounts before his death, separately from the main estate, so that a portion would pass to me in a way that was mine alone, not tied to any joint documentation, not visible in the records Nathaniel might have thought to look at. He had not told me because he had not wanted me to spend his last months worrying about money. He had told Howard everything. He also wrote that the Muskoka cottage had been transferred quietly into my name alone 18 months before his death. Not their names. Mine. You love that porch, he wrote. Don't let anyone take it from you. The last paragraph was short. I've watched you give your whole life to our family, Louise. It was beautiful to witness. But I want the next part, however long it is, to be yours. Spend the money on yourself. Travel somewhere that makes you feel small and glad at the same time. Buy the good wine. Don't wait for permission from anyone. I read the letter 3 times. The second time, I cried. The third time, I didn't. I called Howard back, and we spent 2 hours on the phone going through everything. The amounts Victor had set aside were more than I had realized. Not extravagant, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to make choices. I told Howard I wanted to start making some changes. The first change was the will. I had not updated my own will since Victor died, which Howard gently noted had left several things in a state that Nathaniel might have had legitimate grounds to navigate. I worked with Howard and a lawyer in Barrie, a composed woman named Christine Pelletier, who I had used for the house paperwork years ago, to restructure everything. The Muskoka cottage. I was keeping it. It would not go to Nathaniel. If I passed before I found someone else to leave it to, it would go to the Muskoka Conservancy. The house in Barrie. I was selling it. Not because I was in crisis and not because Sandra's comments had won, but because I had been keeping 12 rooms for a life that no longer needed 12 rooms. And I was tired of the maintenance, and I realized, sitting in Victor's chair reading his letter, that I had been living in the ghost of something rather than inside something real. I found a condominium on the edge of downtown Barrie, smaller, warmer, with a balcony facing west, and a building full of people who seemed to actually use their common spaces. I put a deposit down in March. The second change was harder. I called Nathaniel and told him I wanted to see him. I flew to Vancouver, something I had not done in 2 years, because I had always been the one waiting. And I took him to dinner at a restaurant in Kitsilano that Sandra had once recommended and then never followed up on. I had decided, before I went, that I would not ambush him. I would not arrive with accusations or a list of grievances. Victor had not raised me to be cruel, and I did not want cruelty. I wanted honesty, which is a different and harder thing. I told him about the letter. I watched his face carefully while I spoke. He went very still in the way he used to as a boy when he knew he had done something he couldn't undo. I told him I knew about the conversations with Sandra's parents about the cottage. I told him I had updated my will and restructured my finances, and that I had made arrangements that reflected the relationship we actually had, rather than the one I had spent years pretending we had. I told him that I loved him, and I meant it, completely, but that love was not the same thing as unlimited access to everything I owned. He started to defend himself. He said Sandra's parents had only been trying to help. He said he had assumed I'd want the cottage to stay in the family. He said he hadn't known, which I suspected was partially true and partially not. I let him say all of it. Then I told him that the next chapter of my life was going to look different. I was selling the house. I was keeping the cottage and I intended to use it. I was taking a trip to Portugal in September because Victor had wanted to go and we had never gone. And I was setting aside a portion of Victor's accounts to establish a small fund. Not a grand foundation, nothing with a name on a building, but something real, to support a women's shelter in Barrie that had been quietly underfunded for years, because I had driven past it every week for a decade and I had never done anything. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't call on your birthday." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have." I said, "Yes." We sat there for a while with all of that between us. I had not forgiven him, not yet. Forgiveness is something that happens in its own time, when it's real, and I had learned from Victor not to rush real things. But I had not written him off either. He was my son. He had Victor's eyes and Victor's way of going quiet when he was ashamed. there was still something in him worth reaching. What I told him before the dessert arrived was this: I'm not waiting anymore, Nathaniel. Not for the call, not for the visit, not for you to decide I've waited long enough to matter. I spent 38 years making a home that other people walked through. I'm making one for myself now. He nodded. He didn't say anything, but when he hugged me outside the restaurant, he held on longer than usual. The house in Barrie sold in June. Faster than Christine had expected, at a price that surprised both of us. I packed 38 years into a storage unit first, then sorted through it slowly, over weeks, and gave away more than I kept. I moved into the condo on a Thursday. Patrice brought champagne and her eldest daughter, who carried boxes for 3 hours and refused payment. I stood on the west-facing balcony that evening while the sun went down over the rooftops, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly, but something close to it. Something like arriving. I went to Portugal in September. 9 days. Lisbon first, then a train south to the Alentejo wine region, which I had read about in a travel magazine I had picked up in a waiting room and never thrown away. I walked more than I expected to. I ate dinner alone at outdoor tables and ordered things I couldn't pronounce and didn't ask for the English menu. I bought a small tile at a market in Evora that now sits on my kitchen windowsill. Blue and white, chipped at one corner, depicting a heron standing at the edge of water. On the last night, I sat at a cafe table with a glass of wine and I wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular. To myself, maybe, or to Victor, or to the version of myself who had sat alone in Barrie on her 63rd birthday watching candles melt. I wrote, I found my way to the right door. Nathaniel came to Barrie for Christmas. He came alone. Sandra had a commitment with her own family, which I did not question. He slept on the pullout in my second bedroom, and we ate roast chicken instead of the turkey I used to make that took 2 days and satisfied no one. We watched an old film and argued mildly about whether the ending made sense. He washed the dishes without being asked. Before he left, he stood in the hallway with his coat on and said, The condo is nice, Mom. It suits you. I said, I think so too, he said. I've been thinking about what you said in Vancouver. I waited. He said, I don't know how to fix what I let slide. I don't know if I can. But I want to try. I told him I wasn't asking him to fix anything. I was asking him to show up. Actually show up, not just intend to. That there was a difference between meaning well and being present, and I had spent enough of my life accepting the former in place of the latter. He nodded again, that same quiet, ashamed nod. I hugged him at the door and watched him walk to the rental car and drive away. Then I closed the door of my condo and stood in my own hallway. The walls I had chosen, the light I had chosen, the silence I had, for once, chosen, and I thought about what Victor had written. Don't wait for permission from anyone. I am 64 now. The cottage goes up in spring, repaired dock and all, and I intend to spend most of July there with Patrice and whoever else shows up who I actually want to see. The Women's Shelter Fund is small but real, and Christine is helping me make it a proper named gift. Nothing grand. Just my name and Victor's, quietly attached to something that helps people who are starting over. I still have the lemon cake recipe on a card in my kitchen drawer. Victor's handwriting, the card soft at the edges from handling. Some birthdays I make it, some I don't. But I light the candles every time, and I don't blow them out until I'm ready, and I don't wait for anyone to do it with me. That is enough. That is, it turns out, more than enough.